Live. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again for another Saturday morning science session with the MSU Science Festival. My name's Katherine Hagman. I'm also joined by Roxanne Troon, our coordinator. And today we're also joined by MSU's Jenna Van Fossen and Daniel Griffin. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Of course, happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Of course. So before we start, would you mind giving us just a brief introduction to what you study and your backgrounds, and tell us a little bit about what we'll be talking about this morning?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm a second year in MSU's organizational psychology program. This is a combined MA and PhD program. My research interests sort of fall under studying emotions and motivation in work. Daniel?
Yeah, I'm in the same program, so we study anything with people in organizations. I grew up loving NASA and space. I went to like Astro Camp for a bunch of years growing up, so I was always interested in space program. And when I had this opportunity in grad school to study teams and space situations, I was super excited. So I'm interested in leadership and team dynamics specifically.
Yeah, so we're also both in the same lab under Dr. Steve Kozlowski and Dr. Daisy Chang at MSU, together with, a lot of other grad students. And this lab researches sort of what Daniel talked about, which is really team dynamics and team processes, especially in really isolated, confined, and extreme conditions, which Daniel will talk about. And this lab has also been funded by NASA to study successful, space teams.
Fantastic. That sounds incredible. Really excited for your presentation. And for everyone tuning in, thanks again for joining us. Throughout the presentation, feel free, and we encourage you to, ask any questions that you have in the comments section on the live stream. We will be hosting a Q&A session following the presentation. All right, well, let's get started.
Okay. All right, so we've already gotten into some introductions, but here are some names of the actual people who have worked alongside us and helped us in what we've done and who are active in this lab. So again, that's Dr. Steve Kozlowski and Dr. Daisy Chang. We're both second years in the org psych program. And just organizational psychology as a field really contends with studying the psychology of work and people in organizations. And this lab is the MSU NASA lab, has been funded by NASA to study what we'll talk about. All right. So generally, why is there a need to study, what makes teams of astronauts successful? Well, the major reason is that space travel really appears to be the way of the future. So just last year, NASA announced some new plans to again send astronauts back to the moon by 2024, which is quite recent. And then from the moon, the next plan is to go to Mars. And again, this is, at the level of the government, but there's also appearing to be a really burgeoning industry in space tourism. So this is with several European companies, of course, SpaceX, Elon Musk, but the general trend seems to be that space travel really will be coming up in the future. So we need to be able to actually complete space travel successfully. So what are the sort of obstacles that might really impede having space missions that are effective? Let's consider what actually complete space travel successfully. Okay, I'm hearing, so what are those, like a lag? Okay. So one-way travel to the moon is over 200,000 miles. To Mars, only one way is over 100 million miles. So that's pretty intense. It's a very long distance, really cramped quarters, and astronauts or future space travelers will have to contend with issues like space sickness, just the mental stress and strain, their muscles really just wasting away. and even some vision problems just due to dust particles floating around in their quarters and differences in fluid changing maybe the shape of their eyeballs. So there's some real sort of physical obstacles. But let's consider what astronauts have to say. So the Astronaut Job Analysis Project refers to this project that was completed by organizational psychologists who interviewed 15 former astronauts to gain a sense of what the most critical factors for completing successful space missions are. So this is our most interactive element now. I have an actual timer here for 30 seconds. I want you all to consider what skills or capabilities would be the most important for space travelers on a mission together, to Mars or to the moon. So starting now, please think about this. Okay, that's our budgeted time. So hopefully you had maybe some ideas or thought or started to consider what you think might be important. Here's what they found. So probably unsurprisingly, things like technical abilities, being able to care for oneself, staying motivated, making solid decisions were top rated. But also two of the most critical factors were just the abilities or being able to live in small groups and being able to work effectively as a team. Because again, even though this really intense sort of mission and circumstances and physical habitat are going on around you, you're also with, maybe 5 other people in the same really cramped quarters, undergoing the same sort of strain. So you can imagine how this might start to wear on you, especially now, as we are all sort of sequestered in our own small habitats. All right, so in particular, there are certain characteristics of space travel that make it especially difficult for people to exist in.
So we study what's called ice conditions. Again, Jenna mentioned these astronaut teams. They're in very extreme conditions. And by extreme, I mean there are dangers all around. Dust particles going in your eyes that like make your eyes bulge. The physical extremeness of these NASA missions makes it very, very stressful, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. It's hard to continually function under these situations where you know that you are in peril if you aren't careful. So extreme, isolated. Jenna talked about the distance here for like a Mars mission. If you think about it, the time lag for communications, for a mission on Mars to the Earth is about 20 minutes when Mars is on the other side of the sun from the Earth. That's about 20 minutes one way. So if you think about having a text conversation with someone that you make a text, they get it 20 minutes later, they decide to respond and it comes back 20 minutes after that. It's 40 minutes between texts. I don't know about you, but I don't continue such conversations very well. A phone call would be out of the question. Hello, 40 minutes later. Oh, hi. You know, it's unrealistic, very isolated and then confined. They're living in literally like a tin can, small spaces where they're constantly bumping in with the same 6 to 10 people all the time. These sort of scenarios, which we see in astronaut teams, we see this in some military sort of settings. These are extremely impactful on mental function. And so it's important in order to help these NASA astronauts successfully complete a mission to Mars, we have to help them understand how to overcome these difficulties. Would you go to the next slide? So to illustrate this, let's talk about a story of Nutella. So as Jenna mentioned earlier, we study NASA analogs. So these individuals employed by NASA will go to specific habitats. We'll talk a little bit more about these habitats, but they're all over. And there's small spaces that are supposed to simulate being in a spaceship or on Mars's surface, and they experience delayed communication. So they experience this isolating effect. They live together for anywhere from 3 weeks to a full year in these situations, and we study them to see how we can help train and intervene when there's potential conflicts. This is kind of a fun story just because it's all about Nutella, but we'll share it. So astronauts on a mission to Mars, for example, are going to experience, they're not going to have great food. Think MREs, dry packed food, astronaut ice cream, if you've ever had that. Having that, a year straight is going to be one of those stressors that we have to deal with. Well, in these NASA analogs that we study, they have the same sort of rationing that astronauts will have on a lunar or Martian mission. And they have, in addition to these more basic dry pack type foods, they were able to bring a couple specific special foods. One of them was a jar of Nutella on this one mission. This the story takes place a little bit before our lab actually got involved, but it again illustrates how things work very well. So they all of the team members had specific rations for this jar of Nutella. They knew exactly how much they had so that there wasn't any problem. Now, everyone except for one team member had eaten all of their Nutella, and that last team member was saving it for a special occasion. Don't know exactly the special occasion, maybe a birthday, maybe just something to celebrate with. Well, one of the other team members went in, saw the extra Nutella, figured no one cared, and ate it. Now, think to your experiences recently, but perhaps you've had something like this happen with the COVID-19 situation where you were saving that last cookie because you're trying not to go to the store as much and someone else ate it. Well, for this NASA analog, it led to a cascade of conflicts and problems where everyone, if you see the right picture here, everyone was at each other's throats, to the point that, to my knowledge, they ended up having to cancel this very expensive experiment early, all because of Nutella. Go ahead, next slide. So the key takeaway here is it's really stressful and it's hard to live together in these stressful environments. We need to understand what sort of pitfalls there are so that we can help train and guide these astronauts so that they can be successful. Go ahead.
Especially living in groups.
Yes.
So how can we actually do this? How can we get some useful science that will help us to understand how to effectively manage and promote successful teamwork and small group living in these extreme environments that Daniel detailed? Well, what our lab has done is to actually, within actual habitat scenarios or analogs to these ice conditions of space travel or space missions, is to implement survey designs. So we might have a pre-survey measuring personality of the handful of people who are undergoing a month-long mission, as well as daily surveys. So hosted by Qualtrics, in which team members will report on their attitudes towards the team during the day, the work that they did, how much they like their teammates, etc. And then once their mission is complete, give some reports about how they felt about the mission. Would they work with the same people again? Were their expectations fulfilled? How depressed did they feel during their mission? So these encompass daily reports along with a pre and post mission survey, but daily reports of up to 45 or even longer days in which people were undergoing these ice conditions from all team members. So one variable that we've really been studying is social cohesion, which along with task cohesion represents sort of some bonds or sort of feeling of solidarity with one's group. We know from past research that this variable is really important to promoting team success and as well as member well-being. So we can study these variables in actual conditions that closely sort of mimic the really hard to get at conditions of space travel. But alongside these self-reports, our lab has partnered with Dr. Subir Biswas in the engineering department at MSU to create these wearable sensors that team members just wear around their neck. And then these sensors track their actual interaction patterns. So two people wearing a sensor and who stand within 6 feet of one another, if both sensors register this fact, then this sort of meeting or closeness will be recorded as an interaction. So these small things that go around their neck give us a sense of when people are in proximity with one another and interacting versus away from one another. So this represents some actual objective data alongside reports of how people are feeling and thinking. Our lab is also working on some heart rate monitors and galvanic skin response sensors to get even more physiological data to understand team processes. And here is a little bit of information about the habitats in which these people are wearing these sensors and giving these reports.
Okay, so I just want you, again, coming back, I feel like there's a lot of relevancy to the world today. Think of this as your home in quarantine. So this is one of 3 main habitats that we've worked with. This one is in Johnson Space Center, as you can see on the side. It's that's where they launch the shuttle and so on down in Florida. And so this is just this little, basically tin can where 4 different people stay for 2 months to 4 months at a time. This one's kind of special because they've done a lot of testing on sort of interactions between ground control and the ICE team to see what sort of dynamics are going on there. Again, we have these badges. So we've been studying how they interact inside these small spaces. Go ahead and go to the next one. We also have an analog system that's works with sites in Antarctica. And these are a little different. Instead of living in these habitats that are designed to look kind of like spacecraft, they just live in tents. It's extreme in a very different sense. So they certainly have a little bit more freedom to go outside, but it's frigid all the time. It's Antarctica. So this is kind of a different setting. But again, they go there for 1 month to 18 months at a time, these small groups that get very little external interaction, and we're able to study how they function as a team, how things happen individually, and just try to get a gauge for how we can help these teams cope with these stresses. Go ahead. And the last one we'll mention is one in Hawaii. They have a habitat that we had used in a volcano, a dormant volcano on the edge, where they would simulate what it would be like doing living in these the habitat on Mars. So it's a Martian surface type simulation. So they would do spacewalks, quote unquote, out in this kind of arid Martian-y looking volcanic surface. And living there. These missions were anywhere from 8 months to a year, where we had 6 different team members that, again, huge amount of time delay, confined in this tiny space for a very long time. Go ahead.
All right. So now here are some actual results from the daily reports and the badge data tracking member interactions that we've received from some of the teams that Daniel just discussed in these habitats, some of these habitats. So on the far left here, I have a plot of cohesion across days of the mission for one team. So you can see not everyone fully agrees. And, you know, if we were within an organization or partnering with an organization that was actually responsible for this team in an actual space mission, given the events on day 17, you know, this might be some cause for alarm or some notice that the organization might want to get in contact with the team to know if something happened. In the center, I have a plot of the actual interaction patterns. So how much were people standing, you know, nearby or close within 6 feet of one another for some period of time. And actually the linear trend for interactions is negative. So people actually were nearby to one another for lower periods of time throughout the course of the mission, steadily decreased. So I think now is actually the best time to sort of imagine being in a really sort of small quarters and then going out of your way to avoid 4 or 5 people that you are living in those quarters with. Maybe some of you don't have to imagine currently. And then on the far right here, I have a plot of conflict for one person. So this one individual actually just steadily increased in their rate of fighting with their team members over the course of the mission. So again, if you were a decision maker within an organization responsible for this team of space travelers, knowing a peak about conflict at an earlier date rather than, you know, the end of the mission, you might want to impose an intervention or alert other team members to sit down and talk through it and try to assign someone as a mediator rather than continue on this course of increased conflicts. And here we have a cohesion for another team. So this actually looks kind of negative. This one person really does not feel as though he or she is bonded with their team. Even more negatively, it's the team commander. And cohesion actually decreases slightly for most people over the course of this mission. So again, imagine an intervention where you can go in here earlier and then talk with people to sort of right this negative path. Again, social conflict. We can see, you know, these intense scenarios really do get to people. And within this team, an even steeper decrease in interactions between team members. So this is the data that we have. These are the data. Our current goal is really to work on connecting some of the interaction data to some of the psychological variables of interest, such as social cohesion, to really gain a sense of what sort of team interactions and configurations promote team success in order to get a better sense of when a team breaking point or fracture might be likely to occur in order to go in, stage an intervention, and stop it before it does. So to keep teams on the right course for this upcoming space travel. All right, so thank you so much. And now we have time for questions.
Great, fantastic. We did have one question from Dave he asked earlier. He was wondering during these analog missions, does anyone ever call a timeout with a particular individual, giving them a time to cool off during a conflict? what sort of interventions are sort of happening during these scenarios?
Oh,
Yeah.
so this would be, oh, do you want to go?
Sure. So currently, a lot of what we're looking at is actually without an intervention in order to have kind of a baseline understanding of what happens in these teams without an intervention. So to give an idea, there was, with the Nutella scenario, the next team that went there, the commander that was prepping them for this mission preempted them and told them about the scenario, and it actually made it so there was less conflict, which was good for the team, but it actually is not as good for us because we want to see what's happening when these things fall apart. So interventionary research is an important step, but currently we're looking at kind of understand the baseline dynamics of these conflicts and so on.
Yeah,
So
this would be a hypothetical step for the future, because we know now that this is the sort of course teams, all of our teams actually, every team that we've looked at, they decrease in their actual interaction patterns over the length of the mission. So now we know this. What can we do to stop it?
All right, and just as a reminder to everyone tuning in, please feel free to ask all of your questions for Daniel and Jenna in the comments section. We'll be sure to facilitate finding an answer for you. Let's see, we have another question from Renee. She's wondering, are there any plans to use groups of essential workers, say the 2 teams at power plants right now, as the basis for study groups?
So not for our lab, at least. I don't know, what else NASA has in store. We can talk about, so most of the teams that we've discussed, they are volunteers from NASA, pretty highly trained individuals usually, to sort of get that sort of verisimilitude with the actual astronaut experience. But one of our Antarctica teams contains, anywhere from like 40 people who are just, plumbers, chefs, people who track weather, maintenance personnel, who are stationed within 3 stations over the winter, and their job is really to, work on maintenance in the station, and they're just there, but some of them completed surveys for us as well.
That's great.
So as far as in the current situation, studying teams, just people considered essential right now, I've seen a lot of calls for grants. And so there are people that are passing out money to labs that are studying that. That's just not been the focus of us. So there certainly is research there, and a lot of organizational psychologists are kind of excited. It's a terrible situation, but excited about the very unique chance to study what's going on right now.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to study what's going on in our own homes. Sounds like a great citizen science project.
How many of us have had Nutella scenarios?
Barbara earlier mentioned she knows that scenario well in her own home.
Me too.
Okay.
It would also be interesting to simulate the delay in communication to see if that ramped up cause and effect also of getting along together. When you had mentioned earlier, there's a 20-minute delay. Maybe it would diffuse a situation in your own home.
Yeah, maybe. Definitely is something to look at.
We had a question from Daniel. He wants to know, how do you make sense of all the data you collect with the body sensors? How do you interpret that?
So the data we get from the sensors is kind of a mess, frankly. So that's one of my primary jobs that I've been working with, and there's a whole lot of methodological, statistical stuff we could go on for a long time about why that's a mess, but there's a couple main kind of directions that we go with. One is to look at the trends over time, and you look at how these trends kind of relate. That's a typical sort of approach. So we use algorithms to pull out from these raw sensor data a count of how many interactions you have a day, and then look at how these interactions change, and then the statistical models to look at the trends. Other things we look at are sudden fluctuations or events that might be triggering something else.
Yeah, and I will say as well, like, I know Daniel had some real issues with getting the badge data to work because sometimes people would wear someone else's badge but not really make a note of it. So that was a real hassle. There was also another existing algorithm that Daniel completely redid to better make sense of it. So yeah, that was quite a long process.
Yeah.
Great job, Daniel.
That is fun to deal with. It's a lot of stuff.
With the sensors, can you tell which direction they're facing, if they're facing each other, or is it just more of a location sensor?
It is, so it's specifically, they basically have to be facing each other. So if they're facing away, it won't be recorded as an interaction, or it typically won't. It shouldn't be. But, yeah, it's pretty good at picking up on that.
Yeah. Any thoughts of how you could convert like a personal body cam to get expressions and then try and do some data analysis on like body language or facial expressions?
Oh yeah, you know, another lab that some of our faculty members have collaborated with, they have some sort of algorithms to look at facial expressions or like vocal patterns, I want to say. Daniel, is that?
Yeah,
Right?
there's definitely been a lot of interest in passive data collection is kind of the broad scope. So whether you're using a camera in the ceiling to see how people are interacting, you know, instead of badges, or you're using audio, whatever it is, there's a lot of interest in that, because when you self-report, you might be saying, "Oh no, I'm happy. I'm happy," and you're sitting there plotting the demise of that person's Nutella behind their back. So yeah, there definitely is interest in that. There's a lot of people, both psychologists and computer scientists, engineers, that are all approaching that sort of problem from very different angles. So yeah, it'll be exciting to see what comes out in the near future.
At one point, yeah, at one point a few months ago, we actually looked at some video data in, I think, that Johnson Space Center living pod, but no one actually came up like after someone looked through it for a while. So there probably is something on there, or there might not be, but we do have a lot of data. Sometimes it's just where you're going to focus on.
Right. Yeah. Do you have any questions, Catherine, that you want to ask?
Yeah, for those who joined in sort of during the middle of your talk, could you just give a brief overview again of what organizational psychology is as a field, and also maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your career paths and like why you were inspired to study this.
You want to go first?
Sure.
Daniel?
So I can give an overview of, you know, our field kind of briefly. So industrial organizational psychology, our program is just organizational psychology, but this is a common term, really refers to psychology in the workplace or the psychology of work. So topics like how do you design a job? How do you manage someone's performance, coaching, or teams, work teams, and motivation. These sort of topics that, you know, are relevant to the work experience as well as to people within organizations. So also studying, you know, supervisors who are maybe abusive or leaders who are really great and motivational, workplace and organizations.
Yeah, so I guess going off of that, my interest, like I said at the beginning, I grew up, I was fascinated by astronauts. I worked at a scout camp, and I did a bunch of leadership and team training programs for youth. And so the idea of teams and that sort of thing was very interesting to me growing up. And so I wanted to study what teams were like from an academic standpoint instead of just reading a self-help book by someone who had an opinion once. Um, so that's kind of how I got here. I currently am working on various projects related to this. So I am studying different things related to team resilience, team information processes, just that sort of thing. How do teams work together? How do you simulate that? Career path wise, I hope to become a professor, get a tenure track position, but I would be happy probably doing some sort of consulting with businesses or nonprofits, doing consulting with like Red Cross with how to train emergency response teams that are all volunteer. How do you train them effectively, help them be safe? That sort of thing would be fascinating. So we'll see where I go after I graduate. I've got 3 years yet to go.
Yeah, so our field doesn't have as much name recognition necessarily, but there are IO psychologists working in a lot of consulting firms like McKinsey, or in larger organizations like Ford actually employs quite a few. And one of our recent graduates is going to be working there along with another graduate. Yeah, well, 4 people from the program, at least, because 2 are already there. People in our program have completed summer internships at Facebook, and Johnson & Johnson as well. And they work in, consulting, with organizational change initiatives, or in sometimes HR or in management. So people are out there. So I personally, I'm more interested at the individual level of analysis. I was a psych major and I really enjoyed the research process. But for myself, I wanted to do some science that would have more of a clear, more overt impact on just practice, or how people are, actually living their lives in the world outside of, just university halls. So this is why I went into applied psychology.
I'm going to have to leave the meeting to go set up another one, but I did have a question. We all, as workers or even in schools, have to do these team building exercises. Do you do anything like that? And do you see their interactions, instead of going negatively down, would they, if you did team building exercises, would they be more beneficial? Have you guys studied that at all?
So I've done those. I worked at a scout camp, and that's what I did all summer. I have not really approached the more academic research on those as much. I know there has been a little bit of work on that. So anecdotally, I can say I think that they have a good impact, but as far as research goes, it seems to be more up in the air if there really is a clear statistical relationship. So part of that is it probably depends on like the very specific context, who's there, who's running it. If it's ran well and you've got a good environment for it, maybe it's good, but
yeah.
So there's a lot of research to be done on that sort of thing, and a lot of that stuff is done more based on people's experience and expertise. So yeah,
that's such a fun question. Our lab doesn't really, we don't focus at all on this sort of team development stage. We look at team processes to like establish teams. How do they function day to day? How do they interact? So we're kind of at the middle portion.
I would love to do research on that. It's kind of a dream of mine to have like a ropes course that I take undergrads to and see if it actually helps them.
Oh, yeah. But yeah, I just wondered in these simulations if that's something that, because I know a lot of the times when you go to business meetings, that's one of the things they have you do is do some sort of team, and everyone hates it at first, but at the end you sort of enjoy it, and then you have a more stronger bond with your team. So I just was curious if that was something you would throw in.
Sure.
Yeah,
for sure. I have a fellowship with DOD, and that's one of the things I'm interested in is like, do team building exercises in
Yeah.
like combat teams or emergency response teams.
Yeah.
Do those actually help? And for right now, they're fun, so I'm not going to condemn them, but I think it's for the most part, a question mark, and it
Yeah.
depends.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to beg off and go start the other one, but thank you, and Catherine will be on with you guys to ask more questions.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again for doing this for us.
Bye.
And soon, Roxanne. So we do have about 14 minutes left of our session. So if anyone has any other questions, again, please feel free to enter those into the comments section. We'll address those. We do have another question from Riley. He's wondering if you have any more stories about food, similar to the Nutella story. Is this a common issue during these missions?
There's preparing for this, I was passed a list. I don't have the list right off. So that story happened actually, like I said, before we were actually involved as a lab. It was in one of these habitats, and then we kind of got attached to it, and we heard more secondhand. There are other stories. I don't know all of them right off.
Do you want to hear the?
Oh, go ahead.
I think the worst one that I've heard of was, so this was in a crew of, trained individuals. One team member had an affair with another one, and then also another one, or broke up with the one to go to the other one. And then they're all sort of camped out in tents, so they can hear each other pretty well. But I think that expedition was ended early because the one who was broken up with was really having a terrible time, like mental health wise. So yeah, that's the most salacious.
Sounds like an episode of Big Brother.
It's a lot, yeah.
What are some of the most common conflicts that arise that you've observed?
So we, at least in our literature, we do differentiate between task conflict, so fighting about what's the right way to perform this task or the work to do. People have different ideas. And social conflict, which is more relationship based, it's actually personal, this sort of fight. And task conflict can be sort of healthy for a team to work through to find the best solution. Social conflict is more negative. So the data that we have are really reports of either, but we do have also some sort of qualitative, people write down what they really didn't like. And then it seems to be, some people really just don't get along. Like you'll read through a log and it's like, this person was, this mission specialist one was a very selfish and rude person. This is, kind of all. So that's about the level of detail that we have. Daniel, do you have any stories that you remember off the top of your head?
No, so we're not actually watching them on cameras, every day, and they're like, oh, that was a great conflict. No, what the information we get for the most part, other than anecdotal stories that kind of come through the grapevine, is from these badge data and the surveys. And so, yeah, we do see that there definitely are reported times where there's spikes in people reporting, yeah, there was a lot of conflict in our team. And they'll specify there was a lot of social or there was a lot of task conflict. But we don't have a huge amount of resolution on those, except for the ones that get passed through the grapevine back to us.
Yeah, there is another, in one of the high seas teams, Daniel, there was actually the really most severe break between social cohesion. And it was really like one person, like everyone really did not like this person. And that team member did something like that really bothered everyone else. And that was a clear sort of break point in the graph. Like then social cohesion was terrible. We can see this one person did not interact with anyone else. They just avoided. I don't really know the story behind that because this is a different data set than what we've worked in, a different team.
Yeah, so
But it's
there's that sort of thing quite often. We'll see them break into separate groups or things like that, and that not terribly healthy when you have 6 people. Say you're in an astronaut team, and you all have crucial jobs, and I only really care about this one person. The rest, they can go. Yeah, that's not very healthy.
Well, we're running out of time, so we could probably take one more question. If anyone watching the live stream has a question, please feel free to write that into the comments section. I've seen, as you pointed out a couple times, there's a lot of relevancy to your topic right now in our everyday lives. Do you have any tips for people quarantined with their families on how to promote social cohesion?
So one of the things that we know of, again, this is more anecdotally, there was one of these bigger conflicts that kind of ruined a mission, and just being preempted that could happen made the next team have way less problems. And we're not sure all of the reasons. Maybe part of that was people were just kind of like, oh, I don't want to be that guy, or what the reasons, but anecdotally, it seemed like just understanding that you're in a tough situation, and things like stealing the last Nutella could be problematic for your social health. That being aware of that seems to have been helpful. So just think through the fact that you're probably going to be spending a whole lot of time with these people for the next, we don't know how long. In Michigan, it seems like at least till May 15th at this point. So yeah, keep that in mind.
Yeah, and another thing to consider is that our conditions are not as isolated, confined, and extreme. So feel free to reach out to other people without a time lag.
Go for a walk.
Combat the isolation. Yeah, go outside, for a walk. These are things that had some of our astronaut simulation team members been able to do. We might have some cheerier looking graphs.
All right, let's see. We do have one question from Caleb. He asks, do you feel your research and strategies could benefit athletic teams? And what advice would you give a coach looking to build stronger relationships within their teams?
That's a great question. And there are people who study actual teams of, sports, team sports as teams research. One of our lab alums studies basketball teams. So Daniel, I think you actually know more.
Yeah. So definitely relevant research for sports. There are, as far as psychology goes, there's sports psychology that really focuses on sports. A lot of that's kind of on the individual level. How do you get in this sense of flow and perform better? But part of it is this team level, and from an organizational side, science side, definitely relevant work there. A lot of what we're doing is more focused on these ice teams that are isolated, confined, and extreme. And sports sometimes can artificially generate this sense of extremeness, or maybe not artificially, but it's probably not going to be as confined or isolated. So it is a little different. But yeah, so talking about one of our alums studies these basketball teams and looks at the interactions in a sports setting. How does that predict performance? And what they found is that when you have a strong interconnected patterns, specific patterns of relationships, you end up having better performance. So yeah, there is that sort of relationship. So I think looking at your ability to pass to people that you like to, I think was kind of in there. So if you're able to have these triads where 3 of us actually get along really well, and that lets you move the ball around and gives you more options, that was beneficial. I did not, that is not my research, so I can't really say a ton to that, but yeah, there's definitely is relevant research that we do that impacts team performance and how individuals function in a team that's a sports team.
And of course, there are, some findings that are really robust just from the literature of on leadership in teams. So, team leaders, to promote team effectiveness, should set difficult but very specific goals for the team. And then to make sure that every team member knows every other team member's strengths and weaknesses, and what their roles are within the team. So there are some clear takeaways.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us. That was really insightful. If anyone's curious about learning more about the work that your lab does, where can they learn more?
Well,
I have a lab website.
MSU Psychology website. You can bug Daisy Chang or Steve Kozlowski or either of us. There's an email for us, and we'd surely respond with what we can. NASA has a lot of information about this sort of thing. If you reached out, we could point you towards where there's some more information. I don't have any websites or anything right off.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again. And thanks for everyone who's tuning in. We do have another session on honeybees starting at noon. Hope to see you there. Thanks again. Take care.
Thanks.